Good afternoon. My name is Heather Hughes. I am a faculty lead for humanities at Audrey School, and I am also a trust lead professional for humanities working for the MAT. What today's session is going to be looking at is the role of schema within the teaching and learning of history, um, and why it's so important, and why, if we can get a grip of schema, then we will find that not only are our children more engaged within our lessons, but they also will succeed more, which is obviously at the end of the day what we all want. I'm just going to put on a PowerPoint that I'm going to sort of talk through. It's going to hopefully sort of provoke some thinking on your part. Obviously, at any point, if you wanted to pause this video and have a bit of a think or a bit of a chat with your colleagues, um, that would be great. So if I just share. Oh, okay. So the first thing is to look at, well, why is schema so important, and then we'll sort of dig into what exactly it is and perhaps how we can approach it and look at it within our lessons and our lesson planning. I've got here two quotes from two very different sources. Heidi Fayez, head teacher, wrote a blog for the EEF back in 2021. And she talks about how, there is hopefully a common understanding, a common knowledge that if we could develop amongst our young people a rich connected schema, then that is as she says, a surefire way to create, develop, and embed knowledge, which as history teachers is absolutely vital for our teaching and for the learning that goes on in our classrooms. I would say particularly over the last few years when we're looking at, say, exam groups, there is so much content knowledge now that we are expecting, hoping that our students can carry with them, whether that's Key Stage 4, Key Stage 5. And so this really sort of touches a nerve, I think, for a lot of us, this idea that we need to be able to create, develop, embed this knowledge. Um, the quote goes on and talks about creating a schema is a little bit like walking through or trekking through an overgrown forest, and that it's our job as teachers to wield that axe to make a pathway through for our children, and that will come through high quality instruction, um, and also this understanding that we need to avoid overloading our pupils. This idea of cognitive overload that that we've talked and we've heard a lot about over the last few years. Um, David Orsabel, who was a researcher and a psychologist back in the late 60s, he talks about how schema theory has a tremendous implication for classrooms, and that it's important that we realise as educators that our students, our young people, can actually remember substantial amounts of new information, but only if, and he says, they cluster it to related existing ideas. So that idea that they've got it within their knowledge already, and that we are putting that new information around it so that they can then carry it on, that they can retrieve it. Um, he goes on and said, people forget information if they do not work to integrate it into their existing mental frameworks. And, that's why schema is so important to classroom practice. I've got a diagram here. It comes from the Research Ed magazine, and we've got a before and we've got hopefully an after. And you can see that the before the learning there, you can see how there's no real connections between those four sort of beigey, buff-coloured dots. So that's before learning. When we present within the classroom a new concept, you will start to see that those four initial dots start to link together. Then as we start to explain it, and hopefully our students, our young people start to sort of take that explanation on board, you'll see that the lines around it are starting to darken on the diagram because there's more and more understanding going on, but we're not there yet. And only with practice, surprise, surprise, only with practice that mastery is actually achieved. So we go from the before to the mastery. Now, this is a model of memory in long-term memory store, what we want our students to be having, that they can contain that amount of knowledge in their brains. Now, to help them do that, to help them gain that mastery, it's the idea that, well, can we create connections to existing knowledge, just like previously Orsabel had said? And that's where Schema comes in. That's how we can hopefully get our students moving towards that mastery, moving towards that idea that they can retain, retrieve, and then hopefully in perhaps in an assessment or a piece of work or obviously their exams, they can actually then deploy it correctly. So the before is obviously the starting point. So before we go any further, and I'm sorry if I'm teaching grandmother to suck eggs, but let's just sort of like do a bit of a recap on, just to make sure before we go any further that you're completely sure what it is. So schemas are chunks of information, clusters of information stored in our long-term memory. They contain groups of linked memories or concepts or words, but they are linked. And that's really important, bearing in mind the diagram that you just looked at. Schema grouping of things is acting as a sort of cognitive shortcut. And that means that we can start to store new things, whether that's memories, concepts, knowledge, but we can store it in our long-term memory. And importantly, we can retrieve it much more quickly, efficiently, but actually securely as well, that we can feel quite secure that knowledge is accurate, that knowledge is correct. Now, if we can provide the opportunities to train our young people to be able to do that, then obviously success is going to be a lot more straightforward, but also engagement is going to be there because our students will start to link points together. And I'm sure that you've seen it, that when we're in the classroom and students start to link things together, then the light bulb moments happen, and then obviously the enjoyment kicks in and they start to understand, that's why that was there, and so on. A simple example would be that, so my mother, God bless her, she is the most amazing baker. She makes just gorgeous cakes, and currently is on Christmas cake drive. But whenever I smell a cake being baked, at the age of 48 now, I go back to being a youngster, helping, possibly hindering my mum in the kitchen. But that smell of cakes being baked, to me, that's my mum. And so my mum schema, amongst many other things, but my mum schema is that smell of a cake being baked. And it's immediate, boom, that smell just transports me there. And so that's a form of schema, that's my mum's schema, and I can cluster things around that. And what we want to do is try and use that where possible within our teaching of history. And it's the idea that we, like sometimes like we might organise photos. You might be someone who's got loads of little folders on your phone of photographs. So you organise it, you put it in an album, and it might be bank statements. You always put them in the same folder. Well, the idea is that folder, that picture album contains similar things. So just like the smell sets me off thinking about my mum, the smell of baking. Example might be seaside. So we take that word seaside, and immediately images and words will come into our brain. So it might be things such as, sorry about the typo, things such as beach huts, sand, ice cream, seagulls. Maybe after this summer holiday, rain. It might be any of those things. but by one word, immediately in our head, we've got that little cluster. It's almost like a little mini mind map or spider diagram in our head, the word and all those things that are related to it. We can see how that very quickly brings up memories, brings up understanding. And that's why schema is so powerful for our teaching. It's this retrieval that will allow our students to associate new ideas that we are introducing, that we're presenting, new ideas with what they already know. So what they already know is like a coat hanger. I mean, there's lots of metaphors and I apologise, but this idea that we're hanging new ideas onto it. And it's us getting our heads around, well, what have they already got in there that I can use, that's the centre of this cluster of related concepts, words, knowledge. And if we can associate new ideas and we can pop them onto that existing idea, oh my days, we've got a real chance of our students, our young people, being able to retrieve, being able to remember accurately, comfortably, and quickly. So where does all this come from? Because it's not new. So a little bit of history from a history teacher, obviously. We're going to go back to a British psychologist, a man called Sir Frederick Bartlett. He was the first professor of experimental psychology at Cambridge. He was a pioneer of cognitive psychology. And back in 1932, he published a book called Remembering. And in great detail, he put forward this idea of schema theory. And what he noticed, and it's obvious, but it's important sort of first step is the longer the interval between you reading a piece of information and recalling it, the less accurate our memory is. So obvious, but a really important point. In his experiments, it was clear that something was happening subconsciously to the participants of his experience. And he gave them some text to look at. And he tried to get them to process it and to memorize the key information within it. And the idea being that when his participants in the experiment did it, and it was all about Native Americans, and it was called about ghosts and that in Native American culture. The idea was that without realizing, they were attaching new facts to what they already had in their heads, in their memories. So they were attaching it to points that they already had before the experiment started. Therefore, this idea of schema. It wasn't particularly accepted in the 30s. Cognitive was more seen as more valid, and so it sort of fades out into sort of the background, to be sort of left there until someone else found it and looked at it again. So in the 70s, a guy called Marvin Minsky came along. Now, Minsky was actually looking at AI, which is very topical at the moment. He was a cognitive scientist. He was working at MIT, and his work was looking at how machines could be developed to show human-like abilities. Okay, and so to try and deal with this and the complexities of this problem of a machine behaving like a human being, he realised, and you'll see the link now to Bartlett. He realised that for machines to perceive and to understand the world around them, they needed a frame of reference. They needed prior knowledge to link any new information, any new stimuli to what they already carried with them. And he'd taken that idea from Bartlett, this idea of what do we already have and how can we attach new information to it so that it allows us to recall it, to retrieve it. And then finally, we go to a little bit later in the 70s, late 70s, a man called David Rumelhart. Now, he talked about how schemata had got variables, and that your schema for the word, for example, teach, has got all sorts of different variables, depending on what you want to impart to that person, your career, the situation, your circumstances, or what are the students actually learning, what subject are they in. So these variables have to be part of how you teach this. So you need to think about, well, and he used the idea about being a teacher and he said, well, being a teacher might be, for example, someone who instructs in a classroom, but that can mean different things to different people. And he also went on, and this is really now interesting, that schemata can embed one within another. So the links from that previous diagram that we looked at really can become quite sophisticated. So you've got subschemata. Okay. Any schemata can be accessed from any number of higher schemata. So it's this sort of down. So for example, you could talk about the word school. So school as in place where we all work. Yeah, but it could be a physical building rather than an institution, rather than that experience. Well, no, it's the physical building. Or it could be a large group of fish. So the idea is that when we're looking at schemata, we can't assume that the children get what we want at the centre of that cluster. So when we're talking about something in history, we need to be really specific. We need to make sure that all our students are on the same page as us. We can't just go down the line of, of course this is what the word means. Of course, this is relevant to what I'm going to be sort of giving to them, this new information. He went on and said that schemata represents a more flexible encyclopedic knowledge rather than this idea of definitions. So the idea of pirate, for example. So you might be teaching about pirates, or you might be teaching about, for example, their impact, in history, obviously. So in your head, you've got, oh yes, so when I'm teaching them about pirates, there's an eye patch. I don't know, there might be Johnny Depp, all these ideas. But we've got to be careful, because you could be semantic and you could say, well, pirate movies, pirate music. So you've got to give a very specific example. And so what it sort of finishes off with is this idea that we want our students to be able to link what they learn in the classroom to whatever outside experiences they've had, because that way our classroom learning will stick with them. It will stay with them in the long term. And the other thing that it will let our students do, which is so important in history, is to make mental jumps, to make these links. That high level thinking where they're making these links. We're going, oh, because of that happens. Well, actually, if we can train them and perhaps get them to understand what schema is, be really explicit in this theory, then that's really important. But we have to take into account the issue of cultural capital. If you're going to be looking at schema as part of your pedagogy, as part of your sort of your teaching and your planning, then what you've really got to think about is, what do my students come in with? Because you might find it's very different. You'll have students who have all sorts of experiences, have had the opportunity to travel, have parents that instill with them perhaps a love of learning. But you might have students that don't have that experience. And so the cultural capital levels are going to be all over the place. It's going to be really different. Plus, we have the impact of COVID and how that's affected cultural capital. Plus, we're going through a cost of living crisis. That's going to impact on on cultural capital, on what students are actually being able to access. And that will impact on schema. Just throw a spanner in the works. So you need to think about that, because this stuff's really exciting. It's really interesting, and it can have a massive impact on our children, on our students, and what they can remember when it comes to long-term memory. So bottom up versus top down processing. So this is something I looked at when I started to put this together. And we've got the following, okay? So bottom-up processing. Now, this is in the context of reading, but obviously that's really important to us as history teachers. But this context of reading. So the bottom represents the words on the page that you're reading from. So imagine you've got something in front of you. Bottom-up processing basically means the influence that's exerted on your mind by the words on the page. So there's an example. I've given you a page of text based on something you've got no experience with whatsoever. So you've got to try and then start to work it out. So it's bottom-up processing. When we give our students brand new information, a brand new topic at whatever key stage, they are 100% bottom-up processing. They've got no context. It means nothing to them. Okay? Nothing to them. So you can, I guess you're starting to guess that schema is really important. So top-down processing is a very different experience. Top-down processing is where your schema, your pre-existing knowledge, makes sense of that page, makes sense of that information that you want that child to take in to understand. So, for example, I've just magically educated you all. You can all be pilots, not any old pilot, but space rocket pilot. You can understand all the technical information. Obviously, it's written in the language that you understand. But you stumble upon a manual, space rocket manual, as you do, but it's written in a language you've got no experience. It's all pretty alien. It's all a bit weird. And despite the fact you are an expert space rocket pilot, you can't do anything with the manual. Top-down processing, you've got that pre-existing knowledge, okay? It only works, as it says there, top-down processing, like bottom-up processing, only work when accompanied with the other. So let's pull it back into schemata. As it says at the bottom there, if one of your students can't relate to a new topic, they just don't get it, that you are teaching in your classroom. They've got no pre-existent schemata. They simply will not learn it. They will not learn it. Now, you might have students that can parrot it back to you, but there'll be no understanding. Okay. And therefore, the cognitive load, the amount of effort for their brain goes up, and it's too much. They will not understand it. So therefore, their recall of it, their retrieval is massively hindered. Okay. The accuracy of how they'll be able to write about it, massively hindered. So you need the two, the bottom up, the top down, pre-existing knowledge. How are you going to use that? You can see how it will make a massive difference. So let's talk about these sort of gaps. There's lots of reasons why our students have gaps in their knowledge. You've got gaps in experience. So they don't have any foundational schema. They can't remember. They haven't had that exposure to situations, events, places. So anything abstract, and a lot of history can be to a lot of our young people, it can't root itself. It's got nothing to grab hold of. Then you've got this idea about gaps in memory. So if they've got gaps, there's no connections. That diagram, it can't happen. They can't absorb anything into their memories. So then we get gaps in confidence, gaps in fluency. The knowledge has been encountered, but they can't practice it properly because they can't really get a hold of it. So they're tentative, or they're forgetful, or they're just not accurate. They make mistakes. And then finally, this idea of limited or faulty schema, where knowledge has been arranged into a schema, but there's misconceptions. And we all know how dangerous misconceptions are when you're teaching history. And therefore, students can't quite make sense of any new information that we're giving them. And we give lots of information in history. And we give increasing amounts as we go into Key Stage 4 and obviously Key Stage 5. So there's all sorts of problems that our young people, that our future historians face. This is a direct quote. It comes from Heather Sherman of York College a few years ago. And she talks about why, as an historian, schema obviously has a big impact. And she gives an example. She talks about knowledge of the political spectrum is invaluable to her A-level students. The more that we can introduce something like that at our Key Stage 3 curriculum and our GCSE, obviously the stronger the schemata will be for those 16, 17, 18-year-olds. Okay, so she talked about that if we can introduce ideologies, fascism, communism, totalitarianism, and students will understand why countries get so heated about key events or key people. And she went on to say, like, obviously, if we're looking at the Cold War, it's a no-brainer. But actually, this could have an impact if you're teaching medicine through time. It would help explain why perhaps in the 19th century there was this idea of laissez-faire. Then there was this, there was a very much a sea change. It would help explain why there was the liberal reforms and so on. Understanding right and left wing has, for example, if you've got Nazism on your GCSE or A-level papers, understanding politics is so important. Otherwise, you start having to explain the left and the right and reminding them. Even if you've touched on it in the past, if it's not part of their schemata, they won't have carried it into our GCSE, into A-level. Often, I'll say, but we looked at that in year 7, or we looked at that in year 8, and I'll have a student looking at me and it's not there. They might know, some feudal system, and they understood it back then, but they've not carried it because I didn't attach it to their schematic understanding. How can we develop it? There's a professor of literacy at Minnesota University, a man called Andy Robinson. He looked at the idea of sort of 4 areas: pre-teach. So don't give students reading or information cold. So introduce them to the concepts, introduce them to the ideas that they might not be academically familiar with. So warm them up a little bit. Integrate the new to the known. So this is where the sort of schematic learning schema comes in. We as teachers need to be able to describe and discuss how anything new can relate to what they already know. So we're clustering that new information around their existing knowledge. Highlight the structure of the material to be learned. So let's break it down into clear components. Maybe use graphic organisers. It's something he talked about. But these like chunks, because remember that if we're going to attach it to pre-existing knowledge, we're chunking it. That's how it's going to work. And then finally, we've got to be very careful in the amount that we're going to give them. It doesn't matter if they've got some pre-existing knowledge. We've got to think about it very carefully. If we cover too much, it's not going to hang there, okay? And then what happens is you ignore bits or you'll cover bits because as the learner, as the student, because you can't keep it all there. And Johnson talked about the idea that it's best to cover less but more deeply. Now, obviously, there's certain points we can't choose how much we teach because it's on the syllabus. It's a Key Stage 4, it's Key Stage 5. But if we can, at Key Stage 3, think very carefully about the amount of material that we're giving them and how we can build it in and start to develop their schema, their existing knowledge, and adding to it. If you remember earlier, we talked about adding to schema. Then actually, when we have got to cover more, they'll already have some of it pre-existing in their minds. So that's it. I do kind of rattle through things quite quickly, but I am, and so it might well be that this is a chance for you to talk with your colleagues, to look at your schemes of work. And it might be worth sort of either electronically or on paper going through and saying, right, okay, where do we look at if our students already perhaps have something? Sometimes it might be you've looked at what they've been taught at Key Stage 2 and 1 at the primary, but they come with knowledge as well. And obviously, we said it depends on their family, it depends on their background, depends on their life experiences. But if we can start to somehow, I don't know, audit or think about, well, what do they already have? Then it makes a massive difference. If any of you teach medicine through time or the migration unit at GCSE or crime and punishment, you cover those vast periods of time. Wouldn't it be amazing that, when you introduce a new time period, that they've already got in their heads an idea of what it was like, of what the key concepts were? So that when we say, oh, the industrial time, 1750, 1900, they're immediately going urbanisation, overcrowding, disease, because they've already got that schema, they've got that image in their heads. And so, of course, there's going to be pickpocketing if you're looking at crime and punishment. Of course, there's going to be disease if you're looking at medicine. Of course, there's increased government interest because I know that the working classes starts to have more power. That's schema, that's existing knowledge. So it might well be worth having to think about: are we taking that into account? Are we making assumptions wrongly about what they might already have? Or are we actually a little bit ignorant of pre-existing knowledge that they might have, and how that has a massive impact on the amount of understanding, not just facts, but understanding that they could recall, and they could recall effectively, and they could recall rapidly, and under the pressure eventually of an assessment, a test, an exam. Thank you very much. I hope you found this interesting and useful. And I wish you all the very best with looking at schema and how perhaps it could help enhance your curriculum.